Well, hi everybody, meteorologist Joe Chaffee. Welcome to the Joe Chaffee Show. A number of you have noticed my new weather graphic that I had up there. One of the graphics people over at the SS Storm Chase and Forecast team made that for me. And it looks pretty cool, I think. And I appreciate the kind words that some of you have noticed. So I think what I'm going to do is I'll probably have that up there as we wait. It gives me one less graphic to create. And we'll have that up there as the show waits for air, and then I'll replace it in the library. That's all technical stuff. You don't need to know that. So thanks everybody for being here on this Wednesday night. It's still pretty quiet. Another gorgeous day here. This has got to be one of the best months of weather that I can remember for my area anyway, eastern PA to southern New England, and particularly on Long Island where I live. It's just been terrific. The nights have been cool and comfortable. The days for the most part have been pretty reasonable. Even on the warm days where I am, I get the sea breeze, and that keeps the temperatures from getting too much out of control. So as long as that's the case, I think I'll be a happy camper. And now all I want is one night of temperatures down close to or below the freezing mark so we can get rid of the last of the bugs. Lisa Nieves, thank you for an early super chat hit. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing that. And Scott Brewer, the chairman, was on earlier. His mom is better, much better, and coming along quite well. And we say hi to Mom. And thank you, Scott, for hitting super chat again today. Really appreciate it very, very much. So I know, Lisa, you want to turn off your central air. You shouldn't have needed it on today. I mean, got to about middle to upper 70s at Islip. I think it was about 76 or 7. That's pretty reasonable, and I don't think you're going to need to have it on tonight. I've been sleeping with the window cracked open, and it's been quite comfortable. That's the one thing I don't miss, those August nights where it's really humid, and sometimes even during this time of year and into early October when those nights are really humid and the sheets are sticking to you. That is no fun. Okay, so we are still pretty much in a storm-free zone here across the U.S., certainly when it comes to tropical systems. It is, even though we have Karen may need to see the manager soon or ask for the manager soon because not doing well at all when you look at satellite today. And I think that the Hurricane Center is probably has recognized the fact that maybe the global models are onto something, that Karen is not going to be able to sustain itself very well in the coming days. It could wind up dissipating, even though it's going to be moving toward, at some point, it'll probably moving to the southwest and west. When you see it on the satellite, and we talk about it a bit more, you'll understand more what I'm getting at here. It just does not look good with respect to the structure of the system. There's rain, it's all spread out, and there's no core to speak of. But we'll get back to that in a second. Just take a look at SPC's 7-day forecast, and once again, we're seeing all that dry lack of rainfall in much of the eastern part of the United States, with the exception of upstate New York, way up in upstate New York, northernmost Vermont, and the northern part of Maine. And of course, you see all that loaded moisture back through the Great Lakes and into the middle Mississippi Valley and parts of the plains. We're talking about rainfall amounts on the order of 3, 4, 5 inches or more in spots during the next 7-day period. Cold fronts coming through have more punch in that area of the country, and by the time they come into the east, where we're in this sort of ridge position, the Atlantic is cut off, so there's no moisture from there. The Gulf of Mexico is cut off. There's no moisture from there. I mean, take a look at the rainfall forecast from Louisiana to Georgia and Florida. Except for a few little patches where you're talking about less than 1/10 of an inch of rain, it's bone dry. So the upper atmosphere, and that reflects the upper high. If you follow the edge of the precip, there's your upper high that's sitting there, and the air is sinking from that upper high, drying. It's dry air, and the rainfall is minimal. You get a little bit of precip on the edges of that as you go further to the north, but even here we're talking about minimal amounts of precip all the way up into central New England, generally under a tenth of an inch or less. Out in California, mostly dry. You pick up a little more action as you get up toward northern Washington. And then, of course, all across Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota anyway, and even into parts of northern South Dakota, you're seeing some 1 inch plus rain amounts. It doesn't translate south into Colorado, especially in the eastern part of the state. It's either bone dry or under a tenth of an inch, and dry into western New Mexico and eastern parts of Arizona. So it's pretty much a continuation of the same flow pattern that we've been in, and not any radical change, at least through the next 7 days or so. And with respect to severe weather issues tonight, we don't have any working severe thunderstorm watches. We've just got 2 areas of marginal risk, one sitting up in parts of Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and southeast Kansas, and the other down through southern Arizona and into parts of the desert parts anyway of southern California. So the severe weather risks seem to be winding down a bit. Although we've had a couple of days lately, like yesterday, where we had the enhanced risk going on in parts of Iowa and Wisconsin. But today it is a lot, it's certainly more on the quiet side. All right, so on the U.S. satellite loop, and you can see on the eastern, the lower right, you see the swirl is an upper low. To the northeast of that is what's the remnant low of Jerry, which is passing north of Bermuda and going out. Very little thunderstorm activity with that, just a few showers and maybe some gusty winds, and that's been it. And to the east of the upper low that's in the Bahamas, you have that cloud shield that in there somewhere is Karen. You do not really have a well-defined circulation at all. And when we looked at the last recon, last night at this time we were seeing some winds of 50 to 55 knots. Today, barely to 40 knots on the last recon I saw. So we'll take a look at what the latest information is to see if we can get any clues if they're going to wind up weakening this down to a tropical depression. Meanwhile, from southern New Hampshire and Vermont and upstate New York on southward into Florida, just a few patchy clouds here and there, hardly any shower activity at all. And you can see the clouds sweeping into the Ohio Valley and the other clouds that are racing eastward across the plains and into the upper Midwest. So that's all part of that next cold front that is moving on through. Little upper air feature moving into the southwest, which accounts for the severe weather threat there. There's a cold upper low moving across Baja, some remnant tropical moisture from the tropical systems that have been running around in the Pacific, and that is just about it. So onward to La Karen, and I'm still getting a real kick out of all that urban legend stuff with the name. I think that is so funny. If you haven't been, especially on Twitter, the Urban Dictionary's definition of Karen, and they're attaching phrases to it like call the manager because she can't get her coupons to work, this sort of thing. It sort of describes an elitist, older woman who is quite strong and opinionated, and when she goes into stores, she's always demanding to see the manager. I don't know who came up with this stuff, or if it came out of some movie, but I still find it very funny how everybody just jumps on that sort of thing. Okay, so here is Karen, and if you look carefully, you're going to be hard-pressed to find where this circulation is. I really am having a very tough time picking it out. I think it's up in that northernmost burst of convection. It looks like I can see a little bit of turning underneath there, but look how just disorganized this whole mess is. It almost looks more like an upper trough more than anything else. And then you have, of course, clouds on the western part of this loop. I mean, that's going around the upper low that is sitting in the Bahamas. So you've got a lot of problems here. You also have the issue of dry air. There's dry air all around this. And some of that's gotten entrained into the circulation, and I think that's why you're seeing, this really, I guess the best way to describe it is as just a disheveled look to it. It just looks awful. In fact, let's see if I can find we'll see if we can get a water vapor here on this. They got all these different choices, but you don't always get to see. I think we'll try we can see the low level. Well, we can do both, actually. So let's go. We'll do the mid-level first. So here's the mid-level of Karen, and you can see where all the convection. There's some convection that's bursting there. That's probably somewhere in there is where the circulation is, or on the edge of it. But you got dry air. You got that lighter blue that's to the west, and that darker blue that's to the east. That's all dry air that's getting entrained in this mess. And if we take a look, that's the mid-level. Let's look at the upper level, the lower level. Might show up even more. And remember, now we're looking here in terms of latitude and longitude. This is about a 300-mile square. You can see where Puerto Rico is. You see all the dry air that just surrounds this whole thing, and it just doesn't look good. I'll add some frames. Maybe we can pick the circulation out a bit better here. Whoops. It's in the process thereof. There we go. Yeah, you just look at this, and it really, it just, I wonder how long this is going to hold together going forward. The wider view, they'll pull up the Canadian, I'm sorry, the Caribbean the Caribbean wide view, and take a look at what that has to say for itself. And here we go. Let's put some frames on there. You go back 96 frames, that gives you a good 12-hour plus loop. So here's where you can see both Karen, those brighter white clouds there. You can see the turning of the upper low. You can also see our buddy Jerry. So here's your upper low right in there. You've got Jerry here. So of course you've got dry air, by the way, that's getting that little circulation is kind of entraining south and southeastward toward where Karen is. And then you've got this mess that's moving northeastward. Jerry's actually, to a certain extent, the trough that is involved with this system here with Jerry is actually helping to pour. It's actually helping to pull Karen toward the northeast. Now, once Jerry disappears, we are going to see that as that upper trough pulls out and Jerry just kind of falls apart and disappears, which it's going to do, you're going to start to see Karen, or what's left of Karen, respond to the upper ridge that's going to be building along the southeast coast. Now, on the wider view, we can take a look at our buddy Lorenzo. This is a really impressive system. I've been saying that for the last 3 days, and it still is a very impressive system on the loop here. Look how big this thing is. I mean, top winds 100 miles an hour. It's going to be a major hurricane by this time tomorrow. I still don't see evidence of an eye yet, but I mean, that is just an absolutely wrapped up system, and the circulation still running down almost to the equator. In terms of the higher levels of the higher clouds are kind of being pulled up deep from the tropical Atlantic down to just north of the equator, and then they go all the way up almost to, in fact, now north of 20 degrees north. And you also can see that Lorenzo is responding to the rather deep trough that we have out in the central Atlantic, and it's moving more toward the west-northwest to northwest. In fact, as we watch this loop, you see these clouds. There we go, going like this, and then there's an up in the upper levels of the atmosphere. You've got a really deep. The pen's going crazy here. Come on. Oh boy, I don't know why it does that. Let's try it again. but just get rid of it so you can see at least enough of it. But you can see these clouds moving northwest to southeast, and then these clouds up here running southwest to northeast. So Lorenzo responding to this now, kind of getting drawn northward. And this storm is so vertical, it goes all the way up into the atmosphere, that it's responding more to the upper flow than the low-level flow. The low-level flow for a weaker system would probably carry it west-northwest for quite a while, and possibly even all the way to the Leeward Islands, but it's just not going to do that because it's already so well developed. By the way, you do have a couple of other tropical waves. There's one that's kind of suppressed down to the south. There's another one that's on Africa itself that's probably going to be coming off in another couple of days. So we may see a couple of other systems trying to move across and attempting to do something along the way. I'm not going to really get too wrapped up in it, though, because you got this dominant feature. So sometimes what happens is you got a dominant feature. The next wave that's very close by could be impressive, and then it just gets completely absorbed by it. So the Hurricane Center's forecast on Karen, the only thing that's really changed about it is the fact that they've acknowledged the fact that this probably, they kind of kept the strength around 35, 40 knots all the way through. But if you read their discussion, they pretty well acknowledge that this thing could wind up dissipating and becoming a remnant low. But it's a north-northeast motion, and it does a kind of tight clockwise loop, turns back to the southwest or west-southwest by the time we get to Saturday and Sunday. It'll be moving in a west-southwesterly direction. If it were to develop, it could certainly be a threat to the Bahamas and to Florida, but again, you've got too much, you may have too much working against it. The late afternoon global models really wipe this out. It's very, very hard to find. You can see it here on the late day GFS. What represents Karen is right here, and this is the remnant low of Jerry. And when we move it along, you'll see that Jerry's kind of pulling it to the northeast until that low just dissipates. And as we arrive to Friday night, that's when the Jerry low is just about gone, or at least its influence is gone, and Karen starts to turn west-southwestward. The GFS holds on to a low into Monday and Tuesday, and then it just starts to lose it as it approaches the Bahamas. I'm going to be interested to take a look at this, but let's see if this can help us out. If we pull up the wind shear for early next week, and it kind of makes sense when you look at this. If you look at this, the wind shear map, and I'll roll it back. So Karen is kind of, it's got a little bit of an upper air anticyclone or high over it now, and now that they're moving west-southwestward, it gets a little confusing. So, so there's Karen. It goes up. The circulation here, that is that upper low, and you have this you have a small little upper high underneath Karen, but as it goes westward, it loses that, and then you still have the upper low that is in over the Bahamas actually drops back down into the Gulf of Mexico. So you have these very strong southwesterly winds. I think I better use blue because you'll see it better then. But you've got these very strong southwesterly winds here in the layer between 5,000 and 30,000 feet all across the Bahamas, and Karen is going right into that. So it would be hard to imagine with this kind of a trough here how you're going to get this system to develop. And being that there's nothing to it right now in terms of a core, you'll probably just see it weaken into an open wave. And that shear stays there until late next week, and then it starts to relax a bit. You do have a big upper high that forms here in the Northwest Caribbean, and I think this is why the models earlier today were developing some kind of low there in the Northwest Caribbean that the GFS actually turned into a major hurricane and took it into the southwestern Gulf of Mexico in the longer range period. I can assure you that on this run, it doesn't do that, but it's more important that for this feature verifies, you know, that's a strong upper high that's being indicated here. So if there's some kind of wave under here, and there's pretty good outflow showing up on the GFS in that layer from 5,000 to 30,000 feet. There's some pretty good outflow to the west of any kind of low that might form in the northwest Caribbean later next week. So we might wind up seeing something coming out of there. We'll see what happens. That condition does hold on. In this run, it took the low straight northward, so who knows? But at least from the standpoint of the overall profile of the upper air, it's a little bit, it's interesting that you're getting conditions that may become fairly conducive for something to develop in the northwest Caribbean, and perhaps maybe that means it gets into the Gulf of Mexico at some point. Something to think about in the long range, but certainly not anything to worry about at this point. Okay, so what are we dealing with as far as the longer-term pattern is across the U.S.? Well, a little bit of a change from yesterday to some extent, and the reason being, and I think Lorenzo plays a role in this, by the way, in terms of the overall pattern that's going to be evolving longer term. It might be a force in shifting the pattern around across North America and across Europe, but you can see Lorenzo by early next week is getting wrapped up around a big upper low that forms near Newfoundland. So that's going to go maybe toward the Azores and eventually maybe toward Europe in one form or another, or it could wind up just getting absorbed by this big non-tropical system and become one big post-tropical North Atlantic storm. And it rotates it around toward the southern tip of Greenland. If you follow it, it actually maintains an identity there that it rotates around and moves toward Iceland and then moves northwestward and westward toward Greenland. So that's pretty weird. But you also have energy coming down out of Canada with a trough into the east later next week. And it looks like the models seem to want to get to this point faster on today's runs versus the warmer European yesterday, which had much more of a ridge in the east holding on. The European today and the GFS are not that far apart. So it does bring more of a trough through here later next week, and I think that means that we will probably warm up into Tuesday and possibly into Wednesday, depending on where the frontal boundary lies. But by Thursday of next week, we'll start cooling off. And longer term, I mean, there's the long range on today. Wants to show troughing in the east to a certain extent, and you've got this mess developing up in Canada. So this is a bit more favorable for the delivery of cooler air masses if this verifies. Split flow across the Pacific. You've got a ridge that goes up in western Canada all the way up into Alaska. So you do have a flow from Canada down into the Great Lakes and Plains and eventually into the Northeast. How much of that, how much of that flow really, and how far south does it get? I don't know. You have strong westerly winds in the upper atmosphere from Central California to North Carolina and then out into the open waters of the Atlantic. Not quite a fire hose, but enough of one. And actually, you've got a flow in the Pacific that's almost a straight line into the West Coast. But this ridge here is deflecting it to some point, to a certain extent. So it'll be interesting to see if we do get into this, because it does have a much more fall-like look to the overall pattern if it winds up verifying. All right, so let's bring this off. Let's go back to the U.S. and look at some day-to-day sensible weather and see what it has to tell us. And we'll start from the beginning. So right now, it's all about cold fronts, and we have one that's approaching for tomorrow, and you can see it here, late tomorrow, maybe a shower. We've got another front that is going to go by with not much fanfare. You've got your next low back through Kansas. You've got a little bit of precip here across the northern plains, and yes, that is snow right up here. We got little snow, some snow there up in southwestern Canada. So that front goes by, the next high goes out. This is actually almost an identical situation to what we just went through for Tuesday, Wednesday. Now we're going through it Thursday, Friday. That high moves in. We turn cooler on Friday and have another beauty of a day, much like today. Then Saturday, we get another cold front that comes through. Again, how much will be with it, I don't know. It doesn't really look all that impressive. Bit of a backdoorish look to it. High pressure builds in Maine during Sunday, so we're going to get this northeast flow coming in off the ocean, and there may be some cloud issues with that, but while all that's going on, you've got a fairly deep low here that is developing in South Dakota, and it does actually produce quite a bit of snow. The GFS is producing quite a bit of snow up in Montana and parts of Idaho, and a solid amount of rain across the Dakotas through Minnesota and on up through Wisconsin. There's actually some kind of warm front in here that is going to be in play as well. So we could have a little bit of thunderstorm activity to deal with come later Sunday night into Monday. And then this low is going to push northeastward up into Canada, north of Lake Superior. And there's a trailing front with that attempts, this is Tuesday night, it attempts to get through, but it's not quite going to make it. It's going to probably have to wait for another wave to go by. The high tries to build in over the top, but it doesn't quite nose in. It doesn't quite get there. And then as we get into Thursday is the day that it looks like we have the more serious push of a front going by. And this is a pretty nice size high with a reasonable amount of cool air that drops down into the Great Lakes and Northern Plains and eventually up into upstate New York and New England. I think some of that gets down even into the mid-Atlantic states down into North Carolina by the end of next week, if we want to believe the magnitude of the GFS trough. And again, even the European shows this idea. And then that high settles overhead for the first weekend of the month of October. So it looks like we may have another good weather weekend there. High builds down from Canada. And this is where, of course, it gets dicey. You can see how it also develops that surface low in the Gulf of Mexico. You know, one of the things I do want to look at tonight is just on Lorenzo. For those of you who might be watching our friends in Ireland and England, this might, let's see if this is going to be something that you might have to watch for down the road because of the interaction with the Atlantic low. It looks like that Lorenzo goes west of the Azores and then gets whipped up and around. You see it there. It does maintain its identity, going northwest, northward, and then northeast, north, and then northwestward, rotating around an upper low. I mean, at this point, it's purely extratropical, clearly, but it's just really fun to see this, kind of see this happen, where it runs up northward. So on this particular series, it doesn't go toward Ireland and Scotland. We've had a couple of odd runs where it was keeping it separate from whatever was developing off of Newfoundland. And on this run, it kind of captures it and whips it around. I didn't take a look at the European to see if it did the same thing. And the European, this is, we're looking at the 850 millibar level here, so we're not looking exactly at the surface, but close enough. I just like to look at this map better. Here, it stays separate. It doesn't get captured on the European by the low that develops southeast of Newfoundland. Instead, it remains a separate entity and kind of gets kicked away west of Ireland and Scotland. And if you look on the upper right, you can just still kind of see an identifiable feature there going in toward Norway and Sweden. So I'll tell you what, the way to treat this is we're going to watch it evolve over the next couple of days. I'll pay a little bit closer attention to see if it's going to wind up being a separate feature and go northeastward from the Azores toward your way, or is it going to split the difference somewhere in the middle or get wrapped around like we saw on the GFS. And in Canada, just to see the effects on this, if we pull up the map of southeast Canada, and I'll put the GFS on here, as far as seeing this sort of wrapped up low. So, here are your fronts that are going by, and there's a low that forms out to the east. But you can see the lower pressures that are well out to the east, and you're getting systems coming in from the west that are getting forced out underneath it. So with all that action going on to the Atlantic, it's probably going to mean for a pretty roughed up ocean but it doesn't look like there's much of any impact directly into Newfoundland. But you do have moisture coming in and getting whipped around and producing some snow in Labrador. So there's something for the snow lovers here. How much do they give? Well, not too shabby here in terms of centimeters, up to 20 to 30 centimeters in some areas over the next 10 days. That's not so bad. And I even saw a little mark there up in parts of northern New England. Let's take a look at North America over the next couple of weeks. Again, grain of salt, big grain of salt, but the general principle is there. You're going to see the buildups of snow, where I think you would typically see buildups up from the northern Rockies and on up through western Canada, and also seeing some buildup of snow in Labrador and certainly in northern Canada and up further into Greenland. And for the Siberian snow lover followers, which I'm not even going to get into until we get at least through the first 10 days of October. But here's your snowfall over the next couple of weeks. And actually for this time of September, it's not too shabby here. You got a fair amount of snow being forecast by the GFS model. Still pretty far to the north. I mean, up around 55 and 60 degrees north and points northward. But you also see some snow there on the western flank there, around 60 east, 40 degrees east, and even at the 20 degrees east in northwestern parts of Europe. I guess way up into Norway, Sweden, and Finland, you'll see some snow begin to make an appearance. So it's all part of the long plot to get us to the winter. We've got a long way to go. And before anybody asks, the answer is no, I don't have a long-range forecast because I don't do them. Okay, I seem to have to remind folks that from time to time, but for all the new folks, I don't really do that sort of thing. Okay, it's not much, Chad Mab Slayer. It's early. It's only September 25th. It's a little bit early. We're not even at the beginning of the process yet. This is just the point where we kind of look at it as cheap thrill time. Let's look at snow in late September and see where it is, and that's really about all that we can get from it. We really don't have a whole lot more left to talk about tonight. It's pretty quiet, and fall is canceled. Stop for another week. I will take slight exception to that because this is, given the time of year, there is variability in weather, and you do see seasons that basically bleed in from one to the other. So again, it's not this sort of magic switch that gets flipped. And I'll tell you something, even if we were in a colder than normal pattern, you could still have these warm-ups and take temperatures up into the 80s. So I'm not really, I'm from what I'm seeing, from what I'm seeing here in terms of the overall pattern, it's a late September pattern that you would typically see, groundbreaking in late September. So I wouldn't get too wrapped up in the fall cancel stuff, even if it is for only a week. A cold, blustery autumn, well, you might have some of that I'm sure we're going to have that, some of that in October. You're not going to, this ridge position that we've gotten into is really just part of the same overall pattern that we've had all summer and going back into June, where the upper high, the ridge in the east would flex, and then it would push up for a couple of days, and then move back down with the jet stream moving southward. Pugmaster forever looking for a storm going into the Gulf and into Texas. No. I think what you might see is something else. If you get something to come out of the Caribbean later next week, that's something that the models are showing to a certain extent, and it would make sense given the pattern that we have, that pressures are going to be low in the Western Caribbean and in the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So it might favor for a separate system to get going. But look, you're looking at a very disheveled, ill-defined system now. I would be shocked if it survived. If we had if we had something, a circulation with a good core, a solid core of thunderstorms to work with here, I might have a different view. But it just doesn't look very well developed. So if you don't have anything there, if all you're dealing with is a stretched out low that eventually just dissolves into an open wave and moves westward, I don't know, you won't have anything to work with. So I think your better shot, the better thing to look at, to focus your energy on, is going to be maybe some possibilities coming out of the Northwest Caribbean and going into the Gulf of Mexico from there. So I'm just running through all your chats, you guys. I love how you guys, this has grown so nicely in the last couple of years. We all have conversations with each other when you come on the show, and I really enjoy that. Shelly Man Studios wants a 2017 type of fall, which I am having a tough time remembering. We had a few clippers before Christmas. Okay, well, let's see what happens. Long way to go. Chad Mabslayer wants lake effect snow, but it's looking what? What was that? The chat jumps. I want lake effect snow, but it's looking less and less likely this fall. Why? I'm just kind of curious. How do you, if you come to that conclusion on September 25th? You have already concluded that lake effect snow is going to be less likely this fall. Why? I'm kind of curious as to how you came up with that, because you certainly cannot look at what's going on now and make a connection between what the weather is going to be like for lake effect snowfall, which usually doesn't get underway until you're into at least the early to middle part of November, if not the latter part of November. So I don't know I don't know how you got that. This will be a nice podcast when we get into December. Well, we do have a lot of fun. I will definitely admit that we do have a ton of fun when we get into the winter time. So, and of course, we're going to continue that. And yes, Pugmaster, you've been here since Hurricane Harvey, and I do remember you popping up from time to time. And thanks for coming back. I know you're not here straight through, but thanks certainly for coming back and still being part of the experience here on my YouTube channel. Okay, who asked for the? I just saw somebody ask for teleconnections. But the chat moves, so I'll be Mark Glatfelter. Okay, I haven't looked at them. I haven't looked at these things in a long time, so I will take a look at it now and see what they have to say. So hang on one second here. All right. Well, that's pretty interesting. Okay, so now I haven't spent any time today, so I'm doing this off the top of my head, folks. And this is off the run from last night. So we've had one primary and two secondary runs of the weather models since then. But the teleconnections actually have a negative NAO in play at the moment. Not too strong, but it's there. A pretty strong negative Pacific North America index, so that would explain the ridging in the eastern part of the United States. But it does get mitigated to a certain extent by a negative EPO. So the negative East Pacific oscillation is suggesting that northern jet will be flexing enough so that the ridge will not be overpowering. We get warm for a couple of days, maybe a day and a half or 2 days, Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Not so much Monday if we hold on to the onshore flow, but Tuesday into Wednesday until the front finally gets through. So it's not too bad. If the EPO were flat or positive, then we'd probably be talking about a late season stretch of heat and probably some humidity in the mix too. But that does not appear to be the case from what I've been looking at. The teleconnections are nice, but as I've said many times, they're fun to look at, but I really would be be very, very careful to draw any conclusions from them in terms of specifics. And as I've said many times before, as far as I'm concerned, give me a negative EPO, East Pacific oscillation, anytime, and I'll work with everything else. We need below average temps and polar flow in November, and the long-term models are really warm through December. I know they're far from perfect. I wouldn't even look at them, Chad, to tell you the truth. Why even bother? The last time I looked at the CFS, I think it was above normal for the next 10 months. If you want to put some value in that, I don't know. I just find looking at that stuff sometimes is just, supposedly this stuff is run on a regular basis, a couple of times a day, and I don't really see it change very much. So I'm just looking here. We can have some fun here. Let's have some more fun. We'll look at the long range. Hang on, the long range. Like I said, this to me is just kind of, I don't know how to put it, but it's the day-to-day stuff that gets me. And just because it has above average doesn't mean that, that's over a 30-day period. A lot of things can happen in a 30-day period. So this is supposed to be for October. This is supposed to be for November, December, January. Then finally in February you go below average in the Northeast back to the Great Lakes and near or slightly below normal for March. Okay, so that's that model. That's the CFS. The CANSIPs. Okay, so we can look at that. October, November, December. The CANSIPs you would love because that has it getting starts to get colder than average during December and sort of stays that way through January, February, March, April, May, June, and into July and August of next year. Okay? And then you have the NMME, which I have no idea what this is. All I know about this model is every time I look at it, it's always above normal, everywhere. No matter where this is like through the winter months. Right through February at least, it's all above normal. You know what? And by the way, I just realized this hasn't been run since July 8th, so maybe they don't even run it anymore. So let's see, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. So they didn't run it for August. Maybe they stopped running it. So this is an old model anyway. So we don't care. So there are your climate models. So for all those of you who look at that sort of stuff and want to cancel winter, go ahead. Be my guest. I just think it's all ridiculous to look at that stuff. I doubt if Africa is too big, any tropical system would die out in the Sahara. Well, David Shorts, we are getting to the point now. When you get into late September and early October, the push coming off the African coast usually relaxes. So these waves have a tougher and tougher time moving west across the Atlantic. It's not to say that they can't, but they oftentimes have a tougher time. Johnny Quest, is it possible for a cyclone in the Indian Ocean to cross Africa, reemerge in the Atlantic, and become another hurricane? I would say no, not in its in a tropical form, but you might have it. I don't know. I'd have to really kind of go look at the origins of those systems. But I wouldn't be shocked to see if you get something that originates on the Indian Ocean side, in wave form that moves across. I'm not really overly familiar with how that whole mechanism works in terms of that zone. As you get those propagating waves that go east to west, I don't think I've ever heard of anybody mention something that's been followed. Even from the standpoint of remnants that have moved across and have gone off the other side. And I think David is right. It probably, at some point or another, if it was too far north, the Sahara would catch it, the Serengeti, those dry areas in there would probably just fall apart, and then you'd have something new that would develop on the other side. Jess Harden, don't do long range, okay? I don't know if you're going to get colder weather in the long range in Alabama. I guess maybe at some point you would. I'm just saying. Robert Brown, this winter, can I spend a little more time teaching you the importance of each of the teleconnections? Sure. In fact, what I will do even before the winter, as soon as I'm going to start to get more and more time once my regular employment ceases and I can get to do all my online stuff full time. I will do something for for Patreon members first, and then we'll do it broadly a bit later on for everybody else. I think that's a fair. I think that's a good way to approach it. So, Robert, just remind me, because my almost 61-year-old brain does tend to forget these things. But do remind me. It'll be something I'll try and work on in the next several weeks and get something up there. Okay? So I'm glad you asked that. And don't ever hesitate, by the way, to ask me, folks, if you want something, if you want to look at something or something specific, if I can oblige, I will do that. All right. Speaking of Patreon, that's my subscription platform, which is just $2 a month, and we do a lot of weather on there. And you can talk to me anytime. And I do separate weather videos just for Patreon members. And Mark Gladfelter, you reminded me, last winter I did some things where I kind of quiz the membership to see with some weather questions. Also in snowstorms, kind of made it an exercise to give people a chance to forecast snow for their particular area and see how they did. That's always contingent on how much time I have. But I certainly will try. Like I said, if you guys enjoy that, I will do it. So the link is up there for those of you who are interested in joining Patreon. Do download my free weather app, okay? Because you can use that anywhere. You don't have to be in my area. The local forecast and local conditions default to your location. And you got Zoom Radar, which you can take to any place you want. They're updated on both Google Play and on the App Store, the updated version. It took a while for the iPhone version to come out, but we finally got it last weekend. So it's updated across the board, works for all mobile devices, and it's absolutely free. And if you get those in conjunction with Patreon, it's a good way to support what I'm doing. And one last thing, and an easy way to support what I'm doing in a way that it doesn't cost you a dime, if you use my link on Amazon to do your Amazon shopping. We're a participant in the Amazon Services LLC program, which is a program designed for sites like mine to earn fees by linking to Amazon.com and its affiliated sites. You just use the search bar, buy what you want. You don't have to buy what's on there. You can just search and shop, and Amazon throws me back a little bit of coin so I can get a couple of cigars. No problem, Robert. Between your 66-year-old mind to my 61, one of us will remember. Jeffrey Mara downloaded the app today. Great. I hope you enjoy it. And hopefully I'll be able to do some more updates as we move along. Once again, to Scott Briller and to Lisa Nieves, thank you so much for hitting Super Chat tonight. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and we will see you tomorrow right here on the Joe Chaffee Weather Show on the Joe Chaffee YouTube channel.